Crisis, anyone? By Frank Herbert. Edited by Tim O'Reilly. Introduction by Tim O'Reilly. I found the following two pieces the most helpful in understanding Frank Herbert's basic outlook on life and man's place in the universe. It is a universe of uncertainty, infinite and ever-changing. It is stable only in the minds of human beings who close themselves off from its diversity. Such a universe is frightening to a person in love with security, to a person who trusts in his or her own flexibility, his or her own potential for growth and change. The unknown is the headiest wine. Readers of science fiction have long known this. They dream of a future that will bring radical change to the humdrum lives they live. Even disaster and dystopia may seem attractive, because they bring with them the heroic dreams of individual efforts to meet and overcome enormous difficulties. What too many of us forget, wrapped up in dreams of imaginary worlds, is that we live in the most exciting of imaginary worlds. The uncertainties of the real world far exceed those which fiction models, and so do its possibilities. Frank noted, "It is a mistake to talk about the future. I like to think of futurism as an art form. There are as many possible futures as we can create." I like to think of Frank's work as a series of training manuals on how to live in the real world. Here are the first two lessons. Listening to the left hand. When I was young, and my world was dominated by indestructible adults, I learned an ancient way of thinking that is as dangerous as a rotten board in a stepladder. It told me that the only valuable things were those I could hold unchanged: the love of a wise grandfather, the enticing mystery of the trail through our wood lot into the forest, the feeling of lake water on a hot summer day, the colors, those colors, when I opened my new pencil box on the first day of school. But the grandfather died. A developer bulldozed the woodlot. Loggers clear-cut the forest. The lake is polluted and posted against swimming. Smog has deadened my ability to detect subtle odors, and pencil boxes aren't what they used to be. Neither am I. There may be a quiet spot in my mind where nothing moves and the places of my childhood remain unchanged, but everything else moves and changes. There's dangerous temptation in the nostalgic dream, in the expertise of yesteryear. The nameless animal that is all of us cannot live in places that no longer exist. I want to address myself to the survival of that nameless animal, looking back without regrets at even the best of what was and will never be again. We should salvage what we can, but even salvaging changes things. The way of this change is called process, and it requires that we be prepared to encounter a multiform reality. Line up 3 bowls on a table in front of you. Put ice water in the one on the left, hot water in the one on the right, and lukewarm water in the middle one. Soak your left hand in the ice water and right hand in the hot water for about a minute, then plunge both hands into the bowl of lukewarm water. Your left hand will tell you that the water of the middle bowl is warm. Your right hand will report cold. A small experiment in relativity. We live in a universe dominated by relativity and change, but our intellects keep demanding fixed absolutes. We make our most strident demands for absolutes that contain comforting reassurance. We will misread and/or misunderstand almost anything that challenges our favorite illusions. It has been noted repeatedly that science students, presumably selected for open-mindedness, encounter a basic difficulty when learning to read X-ray plates. Almost universally, they demonstrate an inability to distinguish between what is shown on the plate and what they believe will be shown. They see things that are not there. This reaction can be linked directly to the preset with which they approach the viewing of a plate. When confronted by proof of the extent to which preconceptions influenced their judgment, they tend to react with surprise, anger, and rejection. We are disposed to perceive things as they appear, filtering the appearance through our preconceptions and fitting it into the past forms, including all the outright mistakes, illusions, and myths of the past forms. If we allow only the right hand's message to get through, then cold is the absolute reality to which we cling. When our local reality has attached to it that other message, this is the way out, then we're dealing with a form of holy truth. Cold becomes a way of life. False limits. We must begin to see ourselves without the old illusions, whatever their character may be. The apparently sound step can drop us from the ladder when we least expect it. Herman Kahn's opus on the year 2000 never mentioned environmental concerns. A presidential committee appointed in 1933 by Franklin D. Roosevelt to plot our course through 1952 had not a word about atomic energy, antibiotics, jet propulsion, or transistors. Such levels of perception are worse than inadequate. They impose deadly false limits. They beguile us with a promise that we know what we're doing. The man with broken bones stretched out beneath his ladder doesn't need to look at the rotten step to know what he did wrong. He believed a system that had always worked before would work once more. He had never learned to question the mechanisms and limits imposed by his perceptions. In questioning those mechanisms and limits on a larger scale, we move into an arena dominated by the powerful impositions of genetic heritage and individual experience, the unique influenced by the unique. Here is the conglomerate of behavior biology, the two so entangled that they cannot be separated if we hope to understand their interlocked system. Here is process. You and I, while we strive for a one-system view of this process, are at the same time influenced by it and influence it. We peer myopically at it through the screens of consensus reality, which is a summation of the most popular beliefs of our time. Out of habit/illusion/conservatism, we grapple for something that changes as we touch it. Must we stop the river's motion to understand riverness? Can you understand riverness if you are a particle in its currents? Try this. Think of our human world as a single organism. This organism has characteristics of a person: internal reaction systems, personality, admittedly fragmented, fixed conceptualizations, regular communications lines, analog nerves, guidance systems, and other apparatus unique to an individual. You and I are no more than cells of that organism, solitary cells that often act in disturbing concert for reasons not readily apparent. Against such a background, much of the total species organism's behavior may be better understood if we postulate collective aberrations of human consciousness. If the human species can be represented as one organism, maybe we would understand ourselves better if we recognized that the species organism, all of us, can be neurotic or even psychotic. It's not that all of us are mad, 1 + 1 + 1, etc., but that all of us together make... It's not that all of us are mad, 1 + 1 + 1, etc., but that all of us together can be mad. We may even operate out of something like a species ego. We tend to react together with a remarkable degree of similarity across boundaries that are real only to individual cells, but remain transparent to the species. We tend to go psychotic together. Touch one part and all respond. The totality can learn. This implies a non-verbal chemistry of species, wide communication, whose workings remain largely unknown. It implies that much of our collective behavior may be pre-planned for us in the form of mechanisms that override consciousness. Remember that we're looking for patterns. The wild sexuality of combat troops has been remarked by observers throughout recorded history, and has usually been passed off as a kind of boys will be boys variation on the male mystique. Not until this century have we begun to question that item of consensus reality. Read The Sexual Cycle of Human Warfare by N.I.M. Walter. One of the themes of my own science fiction novel, Dune, is war as a collective orgasm. The idea is coming under discussion in erudite journals, such as the General Systems Yearbook. Assume this concept, then. In it, the giant species organism is perpetually involved with a moving surface of many influences, where every generative encounter is felt as change throughout the system. Some of the cells, we individuals, feel the changes with the brutal impact of a napalm explosion. To others, the transition from one condition to another comes at such a snail crawl that it's barely noticed. But always the species, involved with its longer and larger career, responds to the changes at whatever pace conditions permit. The species organism. Understanding that pace and its conditions requires a different approach to the total human system, that nameless animal of a species organism. In this approach, you no longer can listen only to the right hand that tells you this is the cold way it has always been. You listen as well to the left hand, saying warm, warm, warm. Somewhere in between left and right, you begin to get a glimmering view of things in process now. That glimmering offers the following observations. Something like pheromones, external hormones, interacting between members of the human species to weld groups into collective action organs. How does a mob unite and hold itself together? Isolation cues that separate groups into identifiable substructures, a system possibly influenced by diet. Aside from accent and mannerisms, how do members of the British upper class recognize each other? Conflict igniters, possibly sophisticated abstractions of primitive postures and vocal signals. How do you know that the man coming toward you is angry? Glandular responses to changes in territorial circumstances, responses of remarkable similarity throughout large populations, but with a more complex substitution system than implied by most observers. Why did most of the occupants of Chicago's high-rise Lakeshore ghetto abandon it within 3 years, and what did that experience do to their life expectancy and subsequent behavior? In all of the above, you can expect a suppression of group and individual consciousness and an amplification of group conformity. But even if you answered each of these deductions to our present general satisfaction, you would only have begun the process of understanding. Expect that, too, to change. In our culture, when you make this approach to process thinking, you immediately raise a conflict over whether we individuals, and the groups we form, are reacting on the basis of information. Classical theories of individualism and free will that underlie consensus reality in our society assume a lawless character for the species as a whole. Human nature will never change. Classical theory assumes that we are profoundly different from blind cells, that human individuals are informed, and that their reactions can be ascribed to a rational basis, except in cases of accident and madness. To assume for the species as a whole a response pattern partly habituated, and thus unconscious by definition, threatens belief in reason, where raw stuff, information, is assumed to be openly, consciously available to all. But television directors, politicians, the psychiatric profession, advertising, public relations firms, and sales directors are seeking out predetermined preferences to exploit mass biases. In a very real sense, we already are conducting conversations, communicating, with the species as an organism. For the most part, this communication is not directed at reason. Process and the species organism represent a complex mixture whose entire matrix can be twisted into new shapes by genius, Einstein, or madness, Hitler. The course of this process can be misread by an entire species, despite wide evidence of disaster. To understand this matrix, consider the problems of rat control. We've learned that a quick-acting poison doesn't work well in eliminating rat colonies. Grain treated with a fast poison tends to kill only 1 or 2 rats from a colony. Rats translate the message grain kill without any need for verbalizing. We can, however, kill off entire colonies with a slow poison, such as warfarin. When one rat must go back to the grain 7 or 8 times before dying, other members of his colony tend not to make the life-saving connection. This gives you an idea of what limits may apply to a species' time sense. The presence of a threat may be known, but its context can remain frustratingly diffuse. What is this strange new lethal disease attacking my fellows? It calls up an ancient scenario out of primitive times, when our beliefs were geared to living in the presence of an outer darkness that pressed upon us with terrifying force, mysteriously and inescapably painful. How do you placate the angry spirits of the poisoned waters? The linear habit. Many things complicate our ability to recognize threats to the species. Not the least of these, many may be contained in the observation of Soren Kierkegaard. Life can only be understood backward, but it must be lived forward. This Janus-faced view of life comes right out of the old linear swamp. It carries an attractive sense of reality, but it assumes that our affairs flow with an absolute linearity from a way back there to somewhere way up front. This allows for no optical illusions in time, no compressions or expansions, and it ignores much of our latest computer hardware, 10 billion years in a nanosecond, as well as other odd Einsteinian curves and spirals that intrude upon our consensus reality. It's well to recognize the low probability that one lonely cause underlies any event that inflicts itself upon an entire species. Neither Hitler nor Einstein sprang from a spontaneous and singular generating event. Worldwide pollution has no singular origin. Yet the linear orientation of our perceptions, 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, January, February, March, makes it extremely difficult to break away from the belief that we occupy a universe where there are straightforward linked cause and effect events, plus a few other odd events we call accidents. We are habituated to a non-circular, non-inclusive way of interpreting a universe whose circularity and all-inclusiveness keep cropping up in the phenomena we investigate. Events of tomorrow do change our view of yesterday. An ancient Greek's accident is our better understood phenomenon. The linear habit remains, however. It dictates that we consign accidents to the unconscious. We keep loading the unconscious with events we do not understand. This burden inflicts itself upon our sense of reality. Devotion to that linear consensus leads us inexorably into a confrontation with the mathematician, who tells us we inevitably are led to prove any proposition in terms of unproven propositions. He's telling me that all my pet beliefs inevitably go back to a moment where I am forced to say, I believe this because I believe it. Faith. Mathematics and physics may yet drive the old realities over the brink. For instance, we now can project complex models of human societies through analog computers, and within a few seconds get impressive readouts on the consequences of paper decisions projected for hundreds of years. This is, of course, subject to the omnipresent warning pasted over computers operated by cautious men of science. That warning reads, garbage in, garbage out. In engineering terms, we are looking for resultants, sums of social forces through which to examine our world. This often produces a more realistic approach than taking up the components one by one. Any auto mechanic knows there are engine problems for which it's better to make 10 adjustments at once. Still, singularity as a belief confounds our attempts to repair the system. Technological playthings distort and amplify our performances to the point where we may believe we are discovering futures that we invent in the present. This may be the most elemental reality we have ever encountered, but the distortions born of meeting our unexamined desires to our technology have tangled future and present almost inextricably. Future, past, present. They remain so interwoven deep in the species' psyche that our day-to-day activities are often concealed from us. We put out our own warfarin, unaware of the lethal consequences and forgetful of where we have hidden it. Few who examine our planet-wide problems doubt that we live in a warfarin world. The thrust of my argument is that we are not raising our awareness to the level demanded by the times. We are not making the connections between poisons and processes to the despair of our species. Success as failure. Planners often appear unwilling to believe that a history of success can produce the conditions of disaster. Rather, they believe that success, measured in current terms, is sufficient justification for any decisions about tomorrow. To those who doubt that success can bring ruin to a community, look at the Boeing Corporation, a study of unusual poignancy in its demonstration of disaster brewed from success. You glimpse here a hidden dimension of powerful influence upon our survival. Here are the locked-up decisions predicated on capital investments and operating costs. Governments, large corporations, and service industries know they must build today according to long-range projections. Those projections tend to come from planners who know, unconsciously or otherwise, what the directors want to hear. Conversely, directors tend not to listen to disquieting projections. Boeing's directors were told as far back as the early 1950s that they had to diversify and that they should begin exploring the potential of rapid transit. Planning tends to fall into the absolutist traps I've indicated. Warm is better than cold will listen only to the left hand. The limits under which powerful private assessments of the future are made predict mistakes of gigantic, lethal magnitude. If we define futurism as exploration beyond accepted limits, then the nature of limiting systems becomes our first object of exploration. That nature lies within ourselves. Some who say they are talking about a future are only talking about their own limits. The dominant pattern in current planning betrays a system of thinking that does not want to abandon old assumptions, and that keeps seeking a surprise-free future. But if we lock down the future in the present, we deny that such a future has become the present, and that the present has always been inadequate for the future. My explanation of this pattern goes partly, where we commonly believe meaning is found, in printed words, such as those in the noise of a speaker, in the reader's or listener's awareness, or in some imaginary thought land between these. We tend to forget that we human animals evolved in an ecosystem that has demanded constant improvisation from us. In a mirror sense, we reflect this history of mutual influences in all our systems and processes, including the human brain, our consciousness, and our thinking patterns. The virtuosity of our customary speaking response tends to conceal from us how this behavior is dominated by improvisation. This non-awareness carries over into that talking with our universe by which we shape it and are shaped by it. It dismays some people to think that we are in some kind of a jam session with our universe, and that our survival demands an ever-increasing virtuosity, an ever-improving mastery of our instruments. Whatever we may retain of logic and reason, however, points in that direction. It indicates that the creation of human societies probably should become more of an art form than a plaything of science. To plan for the future, to attempt to guide ourselves into the better life projected by our utopian dreams, we are involving ourselves with profound creative changes and influences. Many of these already are at their work, unrecognized around us. Inevitably, we change our frames of reference, our consensus reality. it becomes increasingly apparent that today's changes occur in a relativistic universe. It is demonstrably impossible in such a universe to test the reliability of one expert by requiring him to agree with another expert. This is a clear message from those physicists who demonstrate the most workable understanding of our universe in operation. After Einstein, they tell us all inertial frames of reference are equivalent. This is saying that there is no absolute frame of reference, local reality, within the systems we recognize. No way to be certain you have measured any absolutes. The very act of introducing the concept absolute into a question precludes an answer with a sensible meaning. Which hand will you believe, the cold hand or the warm one? It serves no purpose to ask whether absolutes exist. Such questions are constructed so as to have no answer in principle. Accordingly, both Pakistan and India could be equally right and equally wrong. This applies also to Democrats and Republicans, to left and right, to Israel and the United Arab Republic, to Irish Protestants and Irish Catholics. Remember, we inevitably are led to prove any proposition in terms of unproven propositions. We do not like unproven propositions. If we face up to this consciously, that might cut us away from everything we want to believe, from everything that comforts us in a universe of unknowns. We would be forced to the realization that the best logic we can construct for a finite system, which describes our condition at any selected moment, might not operate in an infinite system. No matter how tightly we construct our beautiful globes of local reality, no matter how many little Dutch boys we assemble to apply fingers to any holes that may appear, we still have built nothing more than a dike, impermanent and essentially fragile. Breaking patterns. It would seem that a futurist concerned with our survival and our utopian dreams needs to listen, to observe, and to develop expertise that fits the problems as they occur. But that is not the pattern that dominates human behavior today. Instead, we shape our interpretations of our problems to fit existing expertise. This existing expertise defends its local reality on the basis of past successes, not on the demands of our most recent observations. The consequences of such an approach can be deadly, far beyond the circle in which the planning decisions originate. And in the hierarchical arrangements of human societies, it often is just one person who finally makes the profound choice for us all. The reasons behind such decisions can be perfectly justified by the contexts within which they are made. Have I ever failed you before? In the universe thus described, we are destined forever to find ourselves shocked to awareness on paths that we do not recognize, in places where we do not want to be, in a universe that displays no concern over our distress and that may have no center capable of noticing us. God as an absolute stays beyond the reach of our definitions, beyond our questions, beyond any demands we can articulate. The old patterns of thinking, patched together out of primitive communications attempts, continue to hamstring us. Play a game with me, then, and maybe you'll understand what I am attempting to describe. Here's a list of numbers, arranged according to a logical order. The solution to that order, see page 279, embodies what I mean when I suggest we leap out of our conventional limits. The numbers 8, 5, 4, 9, 1, 7, 6, 10, 3, 2. As you consider how the way we approach a question limits our ability to answer, I'd like you to reflect upon a short paraphrase of Spinoza, changed only to read species, where the original read body. No man has yet determined what are the powers of the species. None has yet learned from experience what the species may perform by mere laws of nature, chemical, genetic, or other, or what the species may do without rational determination. For nobody has known as yet the frame of the species so thoroughly as to explain all of its operations. Science fiction and a world in crisis. Washington's Mount Olympus is a pile of dirt and rock with snow on its crown. I can see it out of my study window. It helps sometimes to look out at it and remind myself of Lao Tzu's words. The soul may be a mere pretense. The mind makes very little sense. So let us value the appeal of what we can taste and feel. If you write science fiction in a crisis-ridden world, the value of the pragmatic reasserts itself regularly. You have to say to yourself, as I see it, we need to touch base on occasion, the way Antaeus had to touch the earth. If we don't, we lose an important contact, and we may write sentences such as this one from NASA's Apollo 14 documentary. Astronauts Alan B. Shepard Jr. and Edgar D. Mitchell were climbing a steepening slope on the moon. Their maps indicated that they were approaching their destination, the rim of Cone Crater, where rocks may have remained unchanged since time began. Since time began? You see it all around, in crisis after crisis, how deeply we remain immersed in the Cartesian division between material and mental. It is virtually impossible for anyone conditioned in a Western culture to think with any empirical directness about infinity, about a universe without beginnings and without end, a universe of continual temporary conditions, one merging into another forever. Time does not begin in such a universe. A beginning may be only the moment you notice something move against that background, which ancient India called the void. I found it necessary to begin this way because of something that happened to me at a recent cocktail party. The setting was so common to our culture that it has become a cliché, and so was the tall, heavy-set fellow with the bushy black beard who came up to me with a question often asked of science fiction writers. You science fiction guys have imagined every problem the world could face. What the hell do we do about this planet that's ready to come apart? It is to laugh, but bitterly. With alcohol-induced clarity, the fellow had just realized that the end of the Vietnam War had changed very little in respect to a world balanced precariously on the edge of an explosive finale. The threat of ultimate war is still with us and just as potent as ever. But I've thought about every problem, so... My God, every problem? Not by a long shot on a rainy Monday, otherwise I'd be out of work. In common with the rest of my fellows, I do not have the book of answers. Sorry. I do, however, know something about crises. They're the stuff of good stories. If you write fiction, you become fairly adept at solving unsolvable problems, which, and this is crucial, you have created, that you may solve them entertainingly. Straw men. But every now and then, we hit pay dirt. Realpolitik catches up with fiction. Industry just happens to manufacture the device we imagined. Telstar, Waldo's, the Bracon collapsible oil barge. Technology turns a corner around which we have peaked. You can wake up, as did Cleve Cartmill in 1944, to find yourself answering the questions of suspicious minions from the FBI. Yes, Mr. Cartmill, but you speak in this story of an atomic bomb. Where did you get that idea, and why did you set your story at Manhattan Beach? Cartmill had pretty well laid out the development process of an atom bomb, which was then the private domain of the top-secret Manhattan Project. It was a good story, and John Campbell published it. But who could believe such a coincidence? And who can convince a security-conscious minion of the government that there is no way to keep these things secret, when knowledge about the steps leading up to such developments permeates an entire layer of world society? There is no way. Despite Descartes, mental and material do not separate. But nobody seems to believe that a mere science fiction writer can think up such things out of his own head. The question has a definite accent to it. Where'd you get that idea? Pause. Out of your head? The head of a science fiction author is not supposed to produce the stuff of real crises. We're supposed to entertain, to amuse, to provide interesting food for thought, and, occasionally, to bring people up short with a gasp or two. Vide 1984. Vide Brave New World. When you think about it, you realize these two works have influenced our world. Neither Brave New World nor 1984 will prevent our becoming a planet under Big Brother's thumb, but they make it a little bit less likely. We've been sensitized to the possibility, to the way such a dystopia could evolve. If we're to understand the relationship between such fiction and a world of real crises, it pays us occasionally to look out at Mount Olympus and append some footnotes. With the exception of the fancy eugenics, Brave New World presents us with a society that might have been planned by a committee of behavioral psychologists. In many ways, it resembles nothing more than a worldwide Walden 2. The universal infant conditioning, the College of Emotional Engineering, and the system of world controllers ruling by scientific behavioral modification would appear to meet with the approval of W2 author B.F. Skinner, who, you may recall, has been described as the world's foremost social engineer. Both Orwell and Huxley were concerned with the ability of our democratic institutions to survive the onslaughts of overpopulation and rising industrialism, mass business, mass government, mass automation, etc. They were concerned with their own understanding of that concept which we call freedom. Pause now and consider certain practices by the United States federal government, by state and local authorities here and elsewhere in our world. Consider wiretapping, mandatory lie detector tests, the keeping of extensive files on citizens alleged to be dissenters, refined electronic surveillance, manipulation of the media, the deliberate distortion of meanings in language. All of this foreshadows 1984. Make special note of the ways that have been developed to create demands for goods, the manufacture of goods so shoddy that they break down at a predictable rate, a constant stream of new models which are not really new, advertising propaganda to maintain demand for goods that have little relationship to human survival, the appeal to sexual and status longings, etc. And recall Huxley's words: as political and economic freedom diminishes, sexual freedom tends, compensatingly, to increase. Does that sound familiar? When people such as Theodore Roszak in The Making of a Counterculture take up these themes, then science fiction leaves a realm of fiction and enters a shadowland between myth and reality. Roszak comments on the repressive desublimation factor in playboy sexuality, which has taken over American society. Casual, frolicsome, and vastly promiscuous, it is the anonymous sex of the harem. It creates no binding loyalties, no personal attachments, no distractions from one's primary responsibilities, which are to the company, to one's career and social position, and to the system generally. Whether you begin from science fiction or from educational commentators such as Roszak, you can smell a crisis coming. The promiscuity which Puritans thought would undermine the foundations of society has been co-opted by technocracy and channeled in a way that makes it serve the establishment, maintaining a state of non-freedom, of economic servitude, as well as stability for a social system that allows the technocracy to go on its way. Our society tolerates drugs such as tobacco, alcohol, barbiturates, and tranquilizers because they serve a useful social purpose. They enable people to endure an otherwise intolerable existence, to remain on the production-consumption treadmill. Perhaps 1984 isn't all that far away, and we may already be living in a brave new world. In a society of spocked babies and spooked adults, it gets easier to understand why marijuana, acid, and other drugs are tolerated to help keep the populace under control, especially when you add the mind-numbing properties of TV, audio-visual soma. Whoever said that the realities of 20th century industrial mass society cannot be endured without outside help may not be far from wrong. And the phenomenon of the black-bearded fellow asking a science fiction author for the answer becomes more acceptable. According to Huxley, the greatest triumphs of propaganda have been accomplished not by doing something, but by refraining from doing something. Silence is greater than truth. We'll appoint a committee to study this problem. The assumption by most of today's social engineering types is that independence is not the natural state of man. Vide Brave New World. Misfits are removed to their island. All the people who, for one reason or another, have got too self-consciously individual to fit into community life. All the people who aren't satisfied with orthodoxy, who've got independent ideas of their own. When they begin feeling out of sorts, the people of Brave New World get a jolt from hypnopedic memory, telling them to take a gram of soma, to enter the warm, richly coloured, infinitely friendly world of Soma Holiday. It's clear that both in science fiction and the crisis-beset real world, drugs, like magic, need to be taken seriously and considered significant socially as well as individually. Can't you visualize the sincere announcer on TV telling you, drugs can be of significant value when used in a conscientiously applied program of personal hygiene and regular professional care? In the foreword to Brave New World, Aldous Huxley begins his prescription for the revolution to bring about the world of his book by telling you that, first, the government requires a greatly improved technique of suggestion to make everyone susceptible to the propaganda of the new society. He includes infant conditioning and the use of certain drugs and a greatly transformed norm of sexual behavior from that which our fathers openly accepted. Where Brave New World pointed the way, Masters and Johnson and Kachadorian and Lund follow to fill in the gaps. You've read all of this in science fiction, of course, and made many of the comparisons yourself, and it's nice to think you're sitting here with the avant-garde, first to know what tomorrow's world will be. Let me recommend, therefore, that you study the records of history a bit more carefully. The sexual morality of Brave New World was the norm in the 19th century Oneida colony of upstate New York. The Arab culture pioneered in the use of drugs to control the populace 1,000 years ago. If history teaches us that we learn nothing from history, then there may be little point in rehashing these observations on human behavior. Perhaps it'd be better to save this material for fiction, that world of perfection, which is where things operate the way I want. In the real world, it has all happened before. There's no such thing as a new crisis, just instant replays on the old ones. It's fun to play the game, though, and to hope that your newest window dressing on the old patterns will tell us something really new. After all, science fiction, in its dealings with crises for the sake of story, does indicate other avenues open to us. We can, for example, assume that behind any accepted morality, fictional or otherwise, is the function of maintaining social stability. When emotions brought out by repression become socially disruptive, dangerous to social harmony, then the repression may be eliminated by society itself. Our new morality, so shocking to Middle America, could be an evolutionary force to eliminate potentially disastrous social conditions. It could be the social organism's way of dealing with the need for sexual expression without the dangers inherent in producing too many humans. As you can see by the foregoing, the science fiction mind is always ready with alternative possibilities, which is part of the game of human change. Much of our lives, we're breaking camp from one set of known surroundings and heading off into an unknown other place, which we hope will become just as familiar as today's surroundings. That's the stuff of science fiction, and it is, as well, the stuff of world crises. The hierarchical levels of a future society may very well be sharply defined by categorical birth into different intelligence classes, a birth prearranged from conception. Science of the pragmatic world may give us the aristocracy of the IQ, which previous aristocracies attempted to create by mating only with their own kind. We may look back on 1984 and Brave New World as relatively mild and amusing examples of fictional exploration in social engineering. Much depends upon the way we integrate the myth world of our wishes into the physical experiences that define who we are as an animal society. This is the crux of all attempts to diagnose current conditions and form some articulated whole that expresses the nature of world crises. If we say, on the one hand, that our world suffers from a certain kind of disease that brings on these recurrent crises, then under present conditions of dependence upon words, the disease we have becomes more important than who we are as people. This could be why we, as a society, suspect the large social diagnoses of the engineers and the psychiatrists. We know with a sure and ancient instinct that to be treated and cured of such a disease could take us from both the why and the who of our identity. Certain pitfalls exist in our tendency towards overdependence upon the professional expert, the specialist. When we turn towards such counsel, we begin by admitting that we are helpless and require their superior guidance. At the very moment we seek such help, we have created a particular kind of non-symmetrical relationship. The professional, all-powerful, and knowledgeable on one hand, and the dependent, abject one on the other hand. One side assumes all of the healthy viewpoint, and the other side takes on all the sickness. With a kind of suicidal totality, we turn our matters over to the professional, saying, "Heal me." This is the situation upon which the politician capitalizes, and which the psychiatry have been unable to resolve. Instead, the so-called mental sciences have been seeking political power for many years. This was to be expected, as a natural outcome of their power posture. They assumed the position of all health, dealing with all sickness. Such non-symmetrical relationships inevitably produce shattering crises. Remember the old Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times." The Chinese of those days valued a serene existence. Their utopian ideal was based on a sophisticated appreciation of the world, on the guiding of the senses into heightened awareness. It's not surprising that Zen found wide acceptance in such a culture. The inner world obviously was where one dealt with consciousness. Thus, external crises were to be avoided. Ignorance, poverty, starvation, and disease were the evils. War was a class monopoly and was to be kept in its own place. Famous generals could not hope for the status of famous teachers. Fear was a tool of statecraft and was to be used to keep down the size of government. Apotheosis, transubstantiation to an immortal state with one's ancestors, was a necessary part of culture. In such a setting, interesting times were times that changed dramatically, rolled on the wheel of crisis. Those old Chinese could have made common cause with Middle America. Both look to the ideal society as one of social unity, of togetherness as the ultimate social achievement. The distinguishing of one individual from another has to be held within tight limits. To be different is to be dangerous. God bless the child who has his own. That's the catchphrase, but don't sing it too loudly, except on Saturday nights. This is both a pure and abstract notion. It is the seeking of solace against the physical isolation of the individual identity. It is a barrier against mortality, akin to ancestor worship. It is also the stuff of paradox, because it brings with it dreams of gods, of nations, and professional experts as the all-powerful arbiters of our lives. This necessarily creates the conditions of crisis because it fails to deal with change. It does not square with a changing universe. Thus, we get the stuff of crises and of science fiction. On this relatively small planet, way out into the edge of a minor spiral galaxy, we have been simultaneously breeding ourselves an abundance of humans while creating an abundance of material things for a small proportion of that burgeoning life. Against a backdrop of false absolutes, we reduce the variables that we permit in our societies, in our individuals, and in our possessions. By our acts, we demonstrate that we want mass production of a standard human who employs standardized consumer goods. We execute this mass production of sameness in a largely unexamined, unconscious manner. But nature constantly evolves, trying out its new arrangements, its new kinds of life, its differences, its interesting times, its crises. Against such movement, we attempt our balancing acts, our small sallies at equilibrium. In the dynamic interrelationships of the universe around us, we look for models upon which to pattern our lives. But that universe greets us with complexities everywhere we turn. To talk about just one element, carbon, for example, we are forced to deal with combinations whose complexities we have not yet exhausted. You've read about such things in science fiction. You see the conditions around you which touch your own life. Still, you seek the answer. Our land of plenty was supposed to lead the way to a world of plenty for humankind. Instead, we followed a more ancient pattern, becoming like the worst in those we opposed. We lead the world today in the potential for mass violence. The material doldrums of the 1950s trended gradually into this era, and instead of plenty, we find ourselves in a world where, if we shared the world's food supply equally with every living human being, all of us would starve. Malthus pointed the way. Science fiction has been filling in the possibilities of a Malthusian world ever since. If we experience massive human dieback in such areas as the island of Java, Malthus and science fiction will have been proven correct. But at what a cost? We approach this next level of crises as though we lived constantly in the presence of devils. If no devils appear, we manufacture them. Give us this day our daily devil. To counter the unconscious and conscious tensions aroused by such a process, we seek seclusion, individual privacy, all the while breeding ourselves out of that vanishing commodity. Creativity of any kind has become the modern devil, and the oddball is dangerous. We want to end all conflicts. They not only kill us, they never seem to produce the glorious and victorious end conditions which we verbally attach to them. But now that the Vietnam War has been brought near a close, we awaken to the realization that we still live in a world threatened by imminent, totally destructive mass conflict. We cure the disease and find we still suffer from it. Paradox, paradox, the stuff of crises and of science fiction. We walk across the ground of our fears, and our movement stores up static electricity which shocks us every time we touch the real world. Somehow, we are not grounded to the universe, but we go doggedly about those tasks we consider necessary, emulating the muddle-through quality of the ideal 19th century British public servant. And all the time, we fight to repress the sinking feeling that everything we do is useless, that the next crisis will leave us destitute. Why can't the world be more like me? Middle America über alles. On the wall of a small hotel in Kabul, Afghanistan, there is a notice which reads as follows. Menu. Acid, $1. Opium, 30 Afghanis. Heroin, 70 Afghanis. Ask Abdul. The hotel, populated in season by large numbers of expatriate American youths, represents a full retreat from crises. Retreat from crises into crisis. You may find it strange that I read this and other signs as heralding hard times ahead for science fiction as we have known it. This is how I read it. The current utopian ideal, being touted by people as politically diverse, on the surface but not underneath, as President Richard M. Nixon and Senator Edward M. Kennedy, goes as follows. No deeds of passion allowed, no geniuses, no criminals, no imaginative creators of the new. Satisfaction may be gained only in carefully limited social interactions, in living off the great works of the past. There must be limits to any excitement. Drug yourself into a placid norm. Moderation is the key word. And how the old Chinese would have loved that. In a word, you can be a bozo, but little else. Rolling Stone, in the fall of 1972, described this world of bozo-ness. Bozos are the huge, fat middle waist in the land. They clone. Everybody tends to drift towards bozo-ness. It has Oz in it. They mean well, they like their comforts. The bozos have learned to enjoy their free time, which is all the time. Among the second-hand, limited excitements permitted in the bozo world would be reading science fiction, but its creators are in for harsh treatment unless they hew strictly to the well-worn concepts already treated by the field, unless they eschew anything truly new or pertinent. No more 1984s, no untimely accuracy. You must stick to such things as Walden 2, which is really Edward Bellamy brought up to date. You must look backwards, only backwards. Creativity, however, requires wide-open alternatives. It fits with the random chaos of the unknown universe and with those limited and limiting laws which we learn to apply for our temporary benefit. Science fiction has functioned well against such a backdrop. The more diverse our work, the more profoundly creative, the more luxurious the literature. The luxury of unbridled investigation carries its own ongoing sense of excitement, one of the attractions of the best science fiction. What will I find around the next corner? This is one of the most marvelous lures of pure science as well, and pure science already is finding itself in the public doghouse. The levelers ask, why did you bastards discover atomic weapons and lasers and bacteriological weapons and all that crazy stuff? One of the answers goes this way. I was driving down this road, see, and there it was. But how'd you find the right road? Well, I took that turn back there a ways, and, you see, there it was. The best science fiction and pure science assume an infinite universe where we can look up at the blue sky. That's our playing field. Eden is too confining. That sense of infinity, anything can happen, gives us the proper elbow room. But an infinite universe is a place where crimes of passion can occur, where any dream can be dreamed and realized. The reward of investigating such a universe in fiction or in fact is not so much reducing the unknown, but is increasing it. The reward of investigating such a universe in fiction or in fact is not so much reducing the unknown, but increasing it, opening the way to new dangers, new crises. This implies disorder, when what we suppose we're seeking is order. The story plot and the scientific law represent order, but chaos lurks at their edges. Order requires law, a key word for humans. Law indicates the form by which we attempt to understand order. It enables us to predict and otherwise deal with order, and we don't like the mathematician suggesting to us that we occupy a universe of multiple orders, plural, and thus of multiple laws. Humans want beginnings, and nice anthropomorphic motives, and happy endings. But motives, intent, are not required against an infinite field of laws. The assumption of infinity opens quite a contrary view. Infinity does not require beginnings or endings. Intent does require them. The essence of infinity is no beginning, no ending. Without ends, there can be no absolute ultimate goals, no judgments, and the whole concept of sin and guilt, products of intent, falls apart. Such concepts as sin, guilt, judgment require beginnings which are cut out from an infinitive system, boxed in, articulated, and defined for human motives. They occur as segments of a linear system whose infinite surroundings must be represented as non-linear. Such concepts are ways of dealing with finite, human-created, and human-interpreted laws, and are only incidentally, in the fullest meaning of that word, related to infinity. To project a god, a government, or a professional expert against such a backdrop, we set limits. Law and order represent a system of dealing with interesting times, such that when we set our preordained limits upon crises, law and order is a breeder of crises because it cannot predict everything that will happen. To accept a universe where anything can happen, however, is to accept a hellish insecurity, which is in itself an ongoing crisis. We don't know how to understand such a universe. The essence of something we don't understand is that it appears chaotic. It lacks recognizable order. There's a devil in anything we don't understand. It is menacing. It is an outer darkness in which we not only lose a recognizable ground upon which to stand, but we also lose all sense of identity. It is a vision of hell. We must defeat such a devil at all cost. And we forget that we created this devil. We say instead, this is who I am. This is my absolute God. These are my absolute laws. Get thee behind me, Sathanas. Thus, we strive for the illusion of all-knowing in an infinite universe where anything can happen. We seek the basic law to explain a never-ending all, which stands as a seething backdrop, as the Vedantic void, that ultimate chaos from which any form of law or order must derive. In The God-Makers, I have a religious leader say it this way: we have a very ancient saying, the more God, the more devil. The more flesh, the more worms. The more property, the more anxiety. The more control, the more that needs control. The lost existence of our Eden paradise gets further and further from a dichotomized, man-limited world, less attainable every instant. We must turn to science fiction for the temporary illusion, for the prediction that once again we will enter into the blissful universe of godlike order. You would be astonished at how often science fiction editors get the Adam and Eve story as the first effort of the aspiring writer. It has become the cliché of clichés in our field. We attempt to deny Eden's ultimate, unchanging conservatism, its essential boredom for the questing intelligence. The very language in which these concepts are couched provides a retreat to match the menu on the Kabul hotel's wall. Santaroga Barrier puts it thus: we sift reality through screens composed of ideas, and such ideas have their roots in older ideas. Such idea systems are necessarily limited by language, by the ways we can describe them. That is to say, language cuts the grooves in which our thoughts move. If we seek new validity forms, other laws and other orders, we must step outside language. We must stand silently and point at the new thing. This represents an essential Zen concept. Santaroga portrays an extreme reaction against many of the problems challenging human survival in the 1970s. Technology worship, endless economic growth, human alienation, the limitless powers implied by scientific investigation, all products of today's American-style society, are rejected by Santaroga's counterculture. Santaroga attempts to control change and thus to scale down both the physical and social pace of human life. Isolated, but with a purpose to their hibernation, Santarogans try to make better people for a static world, which is necessarily depicted as a valley, a place of high walls, both natural and man-made. It is the mind, not the artifacts of human ingenuity, on which Santarogans concentrate. However admirable their intentions, the result of their behavioral control is not totally positive. Santaroga is dangerously stable, poised always on the edge of destructive crisis. Its people seem happy, but without individual vitality. They are not enslaved by technological innovation, but neither are they much concerned about creativity and personal development. Life for the Santarogan revolves around an archaic super-loyalty to the community, which is deliberately akin to nation-state patriotism. Santarogans indulge in their own form of the step-by-step behavioral engineering you see in Walden 2. They also remain self-suspended in time. They have chosen a rather static good life to escape the dilemma that Alvin Toffler's Future Shock details. The closed society creates its own Berlin Wall to keep out visitors, tourism, the threats inherent in things and people which are different. Santaroga turns out to be Middle America and Old China brought up to date. As in Walden 2, Santarogans extol the merits of their society and permit selective immigration. Essentially, both Santaroga and Walden 2 ask whether human happiness can be achieved through positive reinforcement techniques and tampering with chemical and psychological characteristics of the species. It is not a question to pass over lightly, because every extant culture does those very things, although in a relatively haphazard manner. The difference is that Walden 2 and Santaroga Barrier describe a conscious scientific approach to social conditioning. Why is it then that most people detect something sinister in such a process to produce humans who would behave in a predictable, although socially beneficial way? Behavioral control and happiness appear to be inextricably linked in the contemporary social engineering field. Most humans feel, however, that such tampering would not produce happiness, but would force us into new crises. We have always distrusted Machiavelli. Is it the coldness, the manipulation of humans by humans? Is it the inevitable separation into the users and the used, the abject seekers after help and the all-knowing helpers? The character Gilbert Dassain sees the common identity of Santaroga thusly. In there, behind the facade, Santaroga did something to its people. They lost personal identity and became masks for something that was the same in all of them, a one-pointedness, such that every Santarogan became an extension of every other Santarogan. Arthur Clarke, in Childhood's End, states it boldly. His entire story represents a comment on differences. He is saying to you that while men have been able to adapt to wide differences in climate, geography, and threats to survival, they have not always been able to adapt to differences in one another. In the end, the children of Clarke's Earth become what can only be interpreted as a single identity, and that identity reflects the myth structure of Western man. Witness the way anthropological studies of acculturation focus on the difficulties a non-Western, underdeveloped people confront while undergoing cultural assimilation by the West. Almost no studies have been done on the difficult adaptation problem faced by Western men thrust into a non-Western society. In fact, Western men tend to refuse such adaptation. We must force others to imitate us. One does not go native. Why can't the universe be more like me? Through what is probably a profound unconscious process, the flow of Western scientific technological development takes on much the same characteristics. Most of science fiction has followed the same channel. Nature, as a system of systems which we attempt to reduce to some kind of order, has been conceived by much of Western science as flowing from a unified field. Eastern researchers have taken a quite contrary viewpoint, saying that a unified field is inconceivable, because even such a mental construct would tend to flow and change. To the Eastern viewpoint, seeking after a fixed, unchanging, unified field is the ultimate in conservative thinking. It requires a god, or government, or society of professional experts, who must be worshipped by a mass consciousness that agrees slavishly with everything coming from the god, the government, or the experts. It is a question of the relationship between human consciousness and the rest of the universe, whether by oneself or through intermediaries. Western culture, selling itself as the last outpost of individualism, has been quick to stifle this characteristic as the East has been. The West has merely been less aware, and thus less candid, about the consequences of its major decisions. It is also a characteristic of the West that we must believe in absolutes. We demand them. Our language assumes them. We ask, what is it? And we say, it either is or it isn't. The verb to be betrays us. Some of the East escapes this pitfall, but shared our tendencies towards the designed state, toward all-inclusive planning. We, in the West, seduced the East not through guns and massive power, but through engineering and planning. We captured most of the Eastern consciousness through engineered contingency factors. An engineer of my acquaintance, servant of a powerful industry, when asked how his industry dealt with unknown contingencies in its long-range plans, said, "We put a very large item in the budget and label it contingency. When the unexpected problem arises, if it's something money won't solve, we borrow facilities from other areas. We patch together a temporary solution until we can fill in the gaps." He went on to explain that the cost of such solutions was added later to the price which the public pays. The question of absolutes, absolute solutions, absolute control, remains at the core of our science fiction, and our approach to the solution of crises. It is, without a doubt, a battle of ingrained conservatism against outer chaos. Our utopian dreams of Eden are essentially conservative. We dream of a designed state wherein all the needs of the designers are secure. The main function of paradise is to entertain the needs of its human creators. Everyone must be a bozo, happily comfortable, and thus limited in severely designed ways. There goes freedom of choice, and in comes Santaruga and Walden too. And God had better answer our prayers, or we'll stop worshipping him. We'll vote for somebody else. Few seem to have remarked the failure of demanding, ego-centered prayer as an argument for the current revival of Satanism, witchcraft, and the like. The morality argument has fallen on hard times recently. Is it significant that both Barry Goldwater and George McGovern, candidates who offered themselves on morality platforms, lost by about the same proportion? There does appear to be an element of moralizing which says, why can't you be more like me? When the chips are down, the American electorate may have said, I'll render my own moral judgments, thank you, and you can stuff that preacher pose. Judge not, lest ye be judged. In a sense, the struggles of our world, the crises arising from these struggles, and the stuff of our literary creations which reflect on the sensory universe, represent a battle over human consciousness and its judgments. It's not so much the minds and hearts of men that are at stake, but their awareness, the ideas they are permitted. The struggle is over what is judged valuable in our universe. Some of the antagonists follow a valuable system based on what can be measured, counted, or tabulated. They call this attitude realpolitik. Others base their standards on undefinable terms, undefinable because they change when we touch them, such as freedom, the rights of man, morality, the law of God. These latter concepts defy programming. They must be continually reinterpreted. Witness the provisions for change in the United States Constitution. Islam provided for Quasi, judges who rule on secular matters as they derive from the Quran. Quasi must be adult, free, Muslim, and unconvicted of slander. Even as they are defined, these concepts fall outside current conventions of language, which, as a set of symbols, remains finite and forever incomplete as a communications tool. Language opens up the reflection of thought, but by its very nature it also creates boundaries which appear insurmountable when posed against infinity. Language programs us, decides what we see and how we see it, what value judgment we place on everything we see. It is a root of prejudice and a limiter of perceptions as the embodiment of previous experiences which have been judged and catalogued. A new occurrence, pervaded by past perceptions, can be misconstrued. Power, secular and religious, is grounded in language. To assault the barriers of language is to do something dangerous to those who hold power, because you open the way to new validity forms, new relationships, new laws, new ways of ordering society. Language represents an intervening force when we articulate our dream utopias. It prevents the realization of dreams. It is a sea of paradox, the substance of interesting times, curses and blessings, and interesting stories. Without language, there would be no science fiction. What a crisis that would be. Remember that Thomas More, the author who gave us the word utopia and the dream of uniformity, which the old Chinese and the modern West find so enchanting, conceived his paradise in the form of the army, as does Skinner in Walden 2, as the pure gospel communists do, as the ancient Essenes did, as they did in the Oneida colony. The rule appears so very simple. From every person according to his ability, and to every person according to his needs. This requires, however, that someone pass judgment on the needs and abilities, setting limits for them. More's utopia provided public kitchens, public clothing repair shops, public laundries, etc., and guidelines for public behavior. I invite you to run your own survey. Ask people who have served in a branch of the military if they judged that a utopian existence. Personally, I recall an unspoken military commandment, no individual crises allowed. Walden 1, as seen through Thoreau's prejudices, was a place where the physical universe and the human spirit were to be interwoven harmoniously. Thoreau permitted no machines. Only the simplest things that the earth provided made up his tools. He professed himself perfectly contented in this condition. Thoreau was not the first on that path. Rousseau drew similar surroundings for his noble savage. St. Francis of Assisi employed his religious genius in rebellion against lifestyles of the 13th century. To know God, it was necessary to discard all material possessions and marry nature. He said, in Christ's words, "The foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath nowhere to lay his head." And then there were the earlier pan-god prototypes. Pan is still with us. Religion says love is the answer. Science says there's infinite energy out there just waiting for the right blend of imagination and creativity to bring it into the service of man. Rebellious youth says, "I'm going back to the farm." The black says, "I want it all, share it." The American Indian says, "Give it back before you wreck everything." The social engineer says, "The key to our many problems remains in proper ordering and efficiency." Listen to the social engineer, because he has the inside track. Constant planning is a Walden 2 obsession. That's familiar, isn't it? There we go again, trying to impose our human order on an infinite universe. However, when we narrow our frame of reference to the Earth itself, as Thoreau did, it appears nature is a circle of delicately balanced systems, which function efficiently only when man doesn't tamper with them. According to this view, man introduces chaos into what was originally a well-ordered plan, a system of symmetry and balances, and our attempts to establish our own kind of order open us to new complexities and crises. But the desire for that abstract condition which we call security is implicit in our attempts to plan and order our lives. Disorder and chaos, the uncertainties of an infinite universe, threaten our peace of mind, if not our physical comfort. Against such a background, behavioral social engineers such as Skinner can be heard pleading with us, "Please, let us plan the world in a way that will set our minds at ease." Translation: why can't everyone be more like me? Because the mind at ease is a dead mind. For civilization to exist as we know it, socializing processes must be strong and pervasively thorough. We are programmed in a multitude of ways, many of them operating unconsciously. By the time we awaken, even faintly, to the awareness that we have been socially conditioned, we find ourselves so indoctrinated that it's difficult, if not impossible, to break the old patterns. The reinforcements of the system are powerful, many of them rooted in our animal past, and such systems have been taken over entirely by the unconscious socializing programs. Our history also shows us that there has always been a majority in human society which never becomes aware of any need for change. Survival pressures demanding that we evolve, grow, and change, however, continue to proliferate. We don't want to change, but the floodgates open abruptly, and we are overwhelmed. Crisis. Western tradition faces such demands with the concept of absolute control. You control the force which seeks to change your world. You build a dam. You organize an army, a navy, an air force, a space service, more efficient police. You control the mob, even that mob in yourself. You control crime, or the mafia, or the heroin traffic. Never mind that the control concept is in direct conflict with the American myth of individuality. The thing you fear must be controlled. How the control concept works with the heroin traffic exemplifies what happens when we apply such pressures to a system without sufficient understanding of the system's internal behavior. Understand first that we have never discovered an upper limit to what the heroin addict will pay for his fix. The demand impulse of the system has a wide-open upper limit, assumed as infinite. Result: New Yorkers no longer live in Fun City. It's Fear City, made that way by this lack of understanding about the drug traffic. New York at night is essentially in a state of siege, reminding one of the Mekong Delta at the height of the Vietnam War. Remember, the night belongs to Charlie. New Yorkers know that their addicts will pay any price asked of them. Your life, your household goods, anything. but our dominant approach continues to operate out of that judgmental edict. Heroin is nasty. Suppress it. Control it. Even with our wildest control binge, however, the heroin traffic cannot be completely shut off. Some of it will get through. Remember the industrial engineer's comment on unknown contingencies? You put in a big contingency fund which is passed along to the consumer. Thus, some heroin will enter the United States because the head of a friendly government, or his uncle or his sister, profits from the traffic, or because a federal agent has been paid off, or because a high United States military officer has become an addict and is forced to use his facilities in the traffic, or, finally, because there are just too many holes through which the stuff can enter the nation. It may cost a bundle to corrupt a federal official, a general, or a member of the State Department, but what the hell, the consumer will pay. Ultimately, even if you are not an addict, that consumer who pays is you. Our control efforts do little more than raise the price of the heroin that does get through. There's no upper limit on that price, thus it's a wide-open system. If we really wanted to make a social adjustment to the heroin traffic, our actions would have to be somewhat different. We would have to accept first that our new approach would bring in its own problems, but it would not be the final and absolute answer. But let's begin by assuming that it's not a good thing to allow a flow of money which can corrupt high officials and whole police departments. Let's assume that we want to stop that flow of corrupting cash. Very well, let's take the profit out of the heroin traffic. We make the addict's fix available at a reasonable price, say for about 50 cents and under medical supervision. Then we prepare ourselves to deal with the other socio-medical aspects of the drug problem which would be certain to surface under these new conditions. We could do this by understanding that we would be dealing with our mutual problem, not controlling it. The one-pointed view of the control it approach invariably seduces us into making faulty assumptions. A fundamental cause of depressed urban areas has been found to be an excess of low-cost housing, rather than the housing shortages which we assumed to be the problem. City tax bases and legal structures gave incentives for not tearing down old buildings, but aging industrial buildings bring a decline in employment. Residential structures, as they age, attract lower-income groups who are forced to use them at a higher population density. Jobs decline when the population rises. Then we come in with our development schemes and add more low-cost housing. This attracts more people from the low-income group into the area where jobs are decreasing. Our well-intentioned efforts help to create what J.W. Forrester of MIT calls a social trap. But that wasn't what we wanted at all, was it? My God, we have to control this sort of thing. Pakistan wanted to control its mosquitoes because the insects are a vector in a runaway malaria problem. However, Pakistan already suffered from the control disease which it caught from our Western culture. Having only enough funds and other resources for about a 75% mosquito control program, Pakistan demonstrated how well it had learned from the West by going ahead with an incomplete program. Result, the surviving mosquitoes are now resistant to former control techniques, and malaria is again on a runaway increase. Attempting to control something evil, we precipitate a larger crisis. This may be a general human tendency. We feel helpless and alone when faced with large problems. Loneliness influences us to grab for the reassurance of anything offered to us as the solution. We want someone to assure us he has the answer if we'll only follow him. It produces very odd behavior. The more complex a problem appears, the more apathetic we become. The more we turn away, the more strongly we grasp at a proffered solution which is presented with the promise of immediate relief. After all, Pakistan's 75% mosquito control program did ease the malaria problem, temporarily. We know that a single-pointed attempt to solve a problem is more likely to increase that problem's complexity, make the problem harder to solve, and eventually confront us with a crisis. The arguments for planet-wide planning of human existence are relatively easy to accept, but the danger of massive single-entry solutions remains as long as humans demand immediate relief. It is astonishing how many college-level young people writing scenarios for a utopian rebuilding of world society begin their scenarios with a worldwide disaster which kills off 90% or more of the human population. The scenarios then have the survivors, including the scenario author, of course, climb back to a planned civilization based on non-repressive freedom. The quote is from an actual scenario by a 20-year-old college junior. Many of these young writers turn to Herbert Marcuse and Paolo Soleri, strange bedfellows indeed, for supportive arguments, and they draw heavily from the works of such writers as Robert Heinlein, Ray Bradbury, Arthur Clarke, Ted Sturgeon, Isaac Asimov, Alfred Bester, Jack Williamson, Tony Boucher, W.A.P. White, John Campbell, Lester Del Rey, Hugo Gernsback, Henry Kuttner, C.M. Kornbluth, Frederick Pohl, Fritz Leiber, Murray Leinster, Judith Merrill, Margaret St. Clair, Idris Seabright, Clifford Simak, Robert Silverberg, William Tenn, Philip Klass, Jack Vance, Paul Anderson, A.E. Van Vogt. This is just a partial list of authors named as sources by students in university classes writing utopian scenarios. The science fiction authors are understandable in this list, but Soleri and Marcuse may need some explanation. Soleri provides them with the concept of arcologies, the single social superstructure, world village, and Marcuse outlines the psychomythology of rebellion. It is Marcuse who provides the justification for killing the world's population down to a manageable size. Soleri leads the scenario writers to think of mining the old cities for materials to construct new super-urban communities linked by high-speed transit. We, in science fiction, provide social and technological innovations, the frosting on the super cake. Inevitably, the scenario writers come down to hard judgments, decisions about the limits within which people will be forced to live. Even with London a half hour from New York City, and most of the world's surviving population living underground to free the surface for agriculture and other human requirements, the consequent accelerated demand for efficiency produces its own paradox which the scenario writers fail to resolve. They turn to more and more planning, a pervasive planning octopus which reaches deeper and deeper into the individual life. Current concepts of freedom are abandoned for the general welfare, and heavy social conditioning is accepted as inevitable. The demand for more God produces more Satan. In come the Skinnerians, and another crisis lurks at the end of this road. Well, the Club of Rome and MIT, in their study of the limits to human growth, warned us what was happening. They said that humans cannot go increasing their numbers anarchically or exponentially beyond specific limits on this finite planet. They told us that growth must be selective, oriented, governed, that is, planned. Equilibrium must be maintained between the human population and its habitat. But this equilibrium cannot be reached if world society remains in a state of imbalance. Social justice and peace have definite ecological impact, but people en masse are loath to face up to issues which seem beyond human comprehension and control. World population, which took hundreds of generations to reach present numbers, will double its size in the next 30 years. That means more than 7 billion people, all demanding homes, schools, industry, entire cities, highways, harbors, and the rest of it. No relevant body of opinion has so far faced up to this challenge. There is no they out there working on the big answer. Some sort of global planning may be undertaken in this decade, but political pitfalls line the way. The problem may become too big and complicated to be dealt with at all before even the first hesitant steps are taken. Now there is a crisis for you. Science fiction has explored such fancies and continues to explore them, but the basis for today's world planning concepts remains firmly seated in a commitment to absolute goals, political and physical. The holders of power in this world have not awakened to the realization that there is no single model of a society, a species, or an individual. There are a variety of models to meet a variety of needs. They meet different expectations and have different goals. The aim of that force which impels us to live may be to produce as many different models as possible. As things now stand, you can be doing something that doesn't need to be done, which in fact is threatening to the survival of the human species, and yet you may be surrounded by a system which says you're doing your job well. The question, should you be doing this at all, is seldom asked in a species-wide context. We remain caught in the old realities with all their myth-based self-justifications. Remember that a way to align your behavior with my desires is to get you to accept my definition of reality. Power rests in getting masses of people to accept your interpretation of events, and this is firmly seated in the structure of language. The words you use, how they are defined as descriptions of events, these carry the weight. Certain definitions are established. Freedom is freedom, damn it, and these are imposed on our social experiences. The delusional content of the definitions is masked by social pressures. Historical knowledge, any past definition, is marshaled to support the way we interpret new experiences. This all occurs within hierarchical structures where the occupants of niches may change, but the structures, their myths, and their delusions remain. There must be an absolute authority which will make everything right eventually. What one learns best in this world is how to please those further up the ladder of authority. Education and social pressures cultivate individuals highly sensitive to the demands coming down to them from above. Most people believe what they are told to believe. The hedge against the unexpected, our social contingency factor, is to continue believing in the possibility of miracles. Of course, if you read the story of Jesus carefully, you'll note that the employment of miracles brought profoundly disruptive crises. I must take another look at Olympus and recall that it's the source of the most disastrous earthquakes which have struck the northwest corner of the United States. Even a pile of dirt can turn against you. Perhaps tomorrow I'll call my friend, the industrial engineer, and warn him there can be no absolute contingency allowance in an infinite universe. As long as that's a condition of our existence, the explorations of science and science fiction will continue to turn up exciting discoveries. But look out for the crises.